Bass is fundamental to pretty much all genres of electronic music, but there are so many different types of bass sounds used in so many different scenarios and ways. So in this video, what I want to do is break down pretty much all of the different bass sounds used across basically all of electronic music genres so that you can get an understanding of why, when, and how they are used. If you're new here, welcome. My name's Matt, and I make tools and tutorials to help you master your music, find your sound, and create with confidence. Let's dive into the video. So it's important to understand that there are really two main types of categories of bass sounds, particularly in electronic music. There are supporting sounds and lead sounds. Now, within these different categories, there are also different specific types of sounds, but these are the two core categories that I like to pin bass sounds into. Bass sounds that fit into the supporting category are typically used in a track to support other musical elements, often providing a harmonic foundation. For instance, here I have a bit of a drum loop that has some chords playing over the top of it. And then if I turn on these sub and sustain tracks, these fall into the category of supporting sounds because all they're really doing is just supporting the other main musical elements, in this case, the chords. This is in contrast to a lead bass sound, which typically takes forefront and center and is more upfront and kind of focal element in a mix. Often it's designed to sound a lot more aggressive and be the thing that really draws your attention, with the focus being on the sound design more so than its musical characteristics. An example of this might be this wobble sound that I've got here. Or these growls. All designed primarily to sit up front in the mix and be the core musical element rather than sitting behind other elements and supporting them harmonically, musically, whatever. So now that we've talked about the difference between supporting bass sounds and lead bass sounds, let's dive into some of the sounds that actually fit into these different categories across most genres of electronic music. And by the way, if you want to learn how to create all these sounds that I'm about to go through, you can check out my Bass Sound Design for Electronic Music Fundamentals course with the link in the description. So starting with the supporting category, the first sound is a sub sound. And this is a really simple sound that's typically designed to sit below even other bass sounds. And the idea with the sub sound is it's really providing the low end foundation for everything else to sit on top of. Here's what the sub bass sounds like, but fair warning, if you're listening through phone or laptop speakers, you might not be able to hear it. And if we take a look down at the spectrum analyzer, we can see that the sub bass really is just focused on pretty much anything below like 80 Hertz. This sub that I'm using here is my simple sub, which you can get as part of my simple bundle, link in the description. But really a sub is just designed to sit underneath other elements, again, even underneath other bass sounds, like something like this sustained bass sound, which is the next type of supporting bass sound. So this sustained bass and this sub bass are the two sounds that were sitting underneath the chords. And this sustained bass, you can hear, again, is more subdued. There's a lot less kind of high frequency content going on in it, but more importantly, musically, all it's really doing is following the root note of the chords or other elements that are playing on top of it. And you can see here, I'm even layering actually the sub below this sustained sound. But for this more sustained bass sound, we want something a little bit more harmonically rich. So using something like a sawtooth wave is typically a good idea. And then using a low pass filter and maybe some distortion to kind of bring out some of the harmonics, but tame the higher frequencies. In this particular instance, I've also got the unison turned up, so we get that kind of detuned super saw-like sound, but you could equally do this without having any unison at all, and it could just be a straight up sawtooth bass. The next type of supporting bass sound that I want to talk about is an 808. Now, 808s can start to get into the less supporting territory and a little bit more into the upfront territory, except for one factor is that they're not often as aggressive. So here's an example of an 808. And you can hear, in a way, it's very similar to the sub bass in that it's focused primarily on the low frequencies, except there's one key difference, which is that it has a really big pitch drop at the beginning of the sound to give it a lot of punch and impact. Here I'm using the simple 808 rack, which again, you can get as part of my simple bundle to showcase this. And the other characteristics of 808s as opposed to something like a sub, as well as that pitch drop, is there's often also an amplitude drop as well. So there's some kind of decay where we have a loud part at the beginning of the sound and decays over time. It can also be common to have 808 sounds play a much more elongated sound. And that way you get to really hear that amplitude decay. And 808 sounds are often used a lot in kind of more halftime music like trap or hip hop, but can also be used in things like jungle as well. And as I mentioned, you can also push an 808 into less of that supporting territory by adding a lot of distortion, grit, noise, etc. But otherwise, if you have that more subdued 808, typically it sits behind all the other musical elements and again provides the harmonic foundation. The next type of primarily supporting bass element that I want to talk about is the pluck bass, which sounds something like this. So you can have it in this more kind of repeated, consistent pattern like I do here to sit again beneath other sounds. For instance, if we played it beneath the chords and put a drum beat behind it. Or you could have it play a more interesting kind of melodic pattern like this. But in this case, it's still generally designed to kind of provide that harmonic foundation. And this is much more similar to an upright or electric bass in styles of not electronic music. And typically how this sound is created is just taking a harmonically rich waveform like a sawtooth and then applying some kind of filter envelope to it with a really short decay to create that kind of plucky characteristic. You can hear that movement on the filter there. But much like 808s, plucks can also kind of range into that more lead territory when we start to make them a little bit more aggressive, therefore making them less of a background element and more of an upfront element. For example, here I've got the simple FM bass from my simple bundle, and you can hear that this has a much more aggressive characteristic, which works really well as a more lead bass type sound. Next up is the Reese Bass. And again, Reese basses can either be supporting or more of a lead sound depending on how they're used and their kind of tonal characteristics. Here's an example of a more kind of supportive Reese bass, which is a lot more subdued. And you can hear the main characteristics of a Reese bass sound being that kind of detuned feeling between two different oscillators. But not only that, also because of this detuned characteristic, we get this kind of beating that means we have this fluttering or wobbling effect, which has a different speed when the sound plays lower versus when it plays higher. Now again, this is really subdued, but if I open up the low pass filter, we can start to make this a much more upfront and in-your-face sound. And then if you go ahead and apply some effects like distortion, maybe even some phases and flanges and stuff, you can get a sound that is much more upfront and turns into much more of that kind of lead type bass sound. For example, this is what I've done here. Now the term Reese bass did come from a very specific style of bass, but now it's kind of just used to describe anything that's really this like big kind of fuzzy distorted sound. And again, you can make it more subdued with something like a low pass filter to push it more into that supporting category, or really open it up, apply distortion, etc. to push it more into that lead category of bass sound. Now speaking of lead sounds, the next type of lead sound I want to talk about is the wobble sound, which sounds like this. And really what this is a consistently held bass sound with just an LFO moving on things like the filter and the amplitude to create that consistent up and down wobbling movement. In this instance, I've got Wavetable here creating this sound, and if I go to LFO1, that's what's creating that wobble movement. And because this wavetable's layered, I've gone ahead and mapped that LFO rate to a macro, and now I can use this rate control to adjust the speed of this wobble, and we now have a kind of performative sound. And you can hear because of how aggressive that is, there's not really room for much other stuff on top of it, therefore it fits really squarely into this lead category of bass sound. The next type of lead bass sound is a growl or a wub, which is very similar to a wobble, except for the key difference that it only happens once and it doesn't repeat. So here, for instance, I have a few different growls going on in this growl group. And again, the difference here between these sounds and that wobble sound is that all of these, instead of having an LFO to move things, have an envelope to move things. Therefore, that movement is only happening once. That up and down movement is only happening once. Again, all these sounds have been created with my simple growl rack, which you can get as part of my simple bundle. Again, the main characteristic of these wub or growl sounds is that we have some kind of envelope that's applying a movement to things like the filter, amplitude, wavetable shape, any other effects like phases, flanges, other filters, etc., just to create that movement over the course of that envelope. Next, the kind of namesake of this category is the bass lead. And this is really a mix between a synth lead and a bass sound. We have the aggressive characteristics of a synth lead, but with the full frequency range of a bass sound. So here's an example of a bass lead. And you can hear one cool thing about this particular type of sound is because it is really a upfront lead sound, you can play around with layering different oscillators at different musical intervals to get some interesting results. For instance, here in this drift, which is creating the sound, I actually have the second oscillator layered 2 octaves and 4 semitones higher, which is a major third, which creates that interesting kind of almost dissonant characteristic. If I detune this up to 7 semitones, or if I pull the octave down to 1, so we now have 1 octave and 7 semitones higher, we get a different characteristic again. And this is a pretty common thing to do with these particular types of bass sounds, these more lead sounds. But really the main characteristics of them is that we have a pretty simple envelope, just kind of an on, sustain, and off. A lot of aggression, a lot of distortion, very high harmonic content in terms of the oscillators. And you can also use things like a pitch envelope at the beginning of the sound to increase the attack or the transient of the sound to help it cut through as well. And last but certainly not least is the acid bass, which you probably have heard before, and it sounds something like this. Now this is a typically pretty simple sound, but the main characteristic of it is that we have a sawtooth or a square wave with a low pass filter that has an envelope on it and a really high resonance. In this instance, I'm actually using Slippery Slope 2 here by Iftar to create this acid sound, and I'm feeding it from Sting 2, also by Iftar, both of which are Max for Live devices that you can get for free on his website. I'll leave a link to them in the description as well. But there's not only the tonal characteristic of acid sounds, which is that really kind of squelchy sound, but also there's kind of the way that these sounds move musically as well, which gives them that distinct characteristic. And that's why something like Sting is really cool, where it generates these acid patterns for you. Again, you can grab both of these for free over on Iftar's website. I'll check the link in the description. They're really great Max for Live devices. And so to recap, there are 2 main categories of bass sounds in pretty much all genres of electronic music. You have supporting bass sounds and lead bass sounds. The supporting bass sounds include things like sub, sustained, 808, pluck, and Reese basses, the more subdued versions. And then the lead category includes things like the more aggressive pluck sound, the more aggressive Reese bass, the more aggressive 808, and then things like the wobble, growl, bass lead, and the acid bass. Again, if you want to learn how to synthesize these sounds for yourself, you can check out my bass sound design for electronic music fundamentals course, or you can check out some of the videos here on my channel, like this video right here. And so with all that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.